Right then, good morning all and welcome to GP Practice Premises, what you need to know. This has been put on in conjunction with Essex LMC. We've obviously tried to run through this live last Thursday, but I was having major connection issues. I was trying to do it from the bar at a hotel during a conference with Link LMC. So my apologies for anybody who attended. I was obviously unable to finish the presentation. We got through around 20 minutes. So I just thought it'd be useful to go through it all again. I will do the first bit as well for those of you who weren't able to attend, but for those of you who attended, you can probably skip to maybe 20 minutes into the presentation. Should be around about where we left off last time. So my apologies again, but look, let's get started. So my name's Will Ellis. I'm the Managing Director here at BW Healthcare Surveyors. The presentation is probably going to take around half an hour. I would have thought 35 minutes or so. And then at the end, we would normally have a Q&A. Obviously, this isn't live. So what I will say is I will direct you to my contact details. There will be my contact details at the end of the presentation. And you can get in touch directly. Either drop me an email or give me a call and be happy to talk about any questions or queries that you might have following this presentation. And I'm sure Essex LMC as well can direct you to myself and my contact details if required. Okay, so what are we going to be talking about today? So the first thing that we're talking about is just a little bit about BW Healthcare Surveyors, who we are, what we do, and just so you kind of understand that we are specialists in the sector, and just understand a little bit more about the company and how we operate. Then we'll be talking about some of the changes in the premises cost directions, the key changes in the premises cost directions that came out last year. So they've been in force now for nearly 12 months. Or over 12 months, in fact. So May 2024 it was. So nearly 18 months. Crikey, time flies. So they've been how the changes, how we're seeing those, and how we're seeing how those changes are affecting practices. We'll then be talking about notional rent. So we'll have talk about a little bit about notional rent, how the review process works, how important it is to get a second opinion when it comes to your notional rent. And then there'll be a section here about GP surgery leases. So the 4 slides all about those practices who are in leasehold premises. Maybe you're up for renewing your lease, or maybe you're talking about setting up a new lease. Just some key you are going through the process. And then back to how to maximize the rental income. So more for owner-occupied practices, and we'll talk about how exactly you can maximize your rental income and steps you can take to do that. And then we'll finish off, and I'll just talk very briefly about some of the free premises things we can assist you with. Really, our free premises health check, some of the reviews that we can do for you free of charge, and how you can claim those basically. Okay, so firstly, a little bit about who BW Healthcare Surveyors. Like I said, my name's Will Ellis. I'm a co-founder and now the managing director here at BW Healthcare Surveyors. I've been doing this for around, it says 14 years there, I think it's nearly 15 now. So around 15 years, I've been supporting GP practices with a wide variety of premises related matters. So as a company, BW Healthcare Surveyors support practices with things like notional rent reviews, so maximising the notional rent that you receive from the NHS, your lease rent reviews, so making sure your landlord isn't overcharging you for the rent that you're paying, and make sure that you're getting fully reimbursed for that rent by the NHS. We can assist lease practices with their lease renewals to make sure they have all the necessary protections in their lease, to make sure that they don't fall foul of those through the lease cycle. We do market valuations as well, so things like if you're having partnership changes or you want the surgery valued, we can do that for practices, give you an idea of what the surgery is going to be worth on the open market, and also sale and lease back. So we take a number of practices through sale and lease back, and that's where you would effectively sell the surgery to an investor. A third party would come in, purchase the premises, but you would still hold the contract, still run the practice as normal. You just no longer own the premises. So we assist practices through a wide variety of things. We also do things like pharmacy rent reviews as well. So anything premises related, really. What we always say is if we don't know how or we can't assist you, we'll certainly know somebody who can. Will be able to point you in the right direction. So if you've got any queries or questions with regards to your premises, give us a call. I'm sure we'll be able to assist you in some way. So we've been doing this for nearly 8 years as an organisation. So BW Healthcare Surveyors was set up in 2017. We've already helped around 1,500 GP practices all up and down the UK. So that's probably maybe 10-15% of all practices we've assisted already in that short period of time when we've been in operation. And we are actually ranked #1 for specialist primary care surveyors on Practice Index, an extremely niche sector, but we're the best apparently, certainly are according to the reviews. So we've got over 155-star reviews now from our clients telling us how great we are. So we are immensely proud of that. And as an organisation, we employ 8 specialist primary care surveyors. 2 of them are actually our directors. We've got a couple of ex-district valuers as well on our books. So a nice variety of specialist surveyors. But it's all we do on a day-to-day basis is help practices with their premises-related matters. Okay, so that's enough about BW Healthcare Surveyors. Hopefully you've got an idea of who we are, what we do. Hopefully you now understand that we kind of know what we're talking about when it comes to primary care premises, and this presentation will hopefully help you understand a little bit about some of the knowledge that we have. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the premises cost directions. So for those of you who aren't aware, the new premises cost directions came out in May 2024. They replaced the previous 2013 cost directions, which were extremely out of date, and a lot of things have changed between 2013 and 2024 in primary care. So a lot of people were waiting eagerly to see what changes have been made. So some of the key changes that we've come across, one of the biggest changes is the change in the lease rent review process. So if you are in a leasehold premises, you will probably be fully aware, if you've had a rent review, that the process is slightly different now. So in 2013, when the premises cost directions were governed by the 2013 version, rent reviews were a little bit simple when you're in a leasehold premises. So the landlord would instigate a rent review, you'd pass that on to the ICB or the CCG at the time, and then the landlord and the CCG would just negotiate between themselves. You'd have very little input, and you just sign a paper at the end, and that was the end of it. The ICB, in their wisdom, have decided that they want the practices to be more involved in that process. And now, as a practice, you are going to have to negotiate directly with the landlord to agree a fair rent prior to the ICB instructing their own surveyor, so the district valuer, to get involved. So it's an extra layer of negotiation. It seems completely unnecessary from our point of view. I don't see why there's any issue with the landlord negotiating directly with the district valuer, but apparently that can't happen anymore. So practices are actually having to pay companies to assist with their negotiations for something that isn't really needed. So that is a service that we offer. We try and help practices hold their hands through the process with minimal input. To be honest with you, we try and get involved as little as we can. Some ICBs are happy for us to just draft a letter for practices to say that we've looked at it and it looks about right, the rent. Some want us to have detailed negotiations and demonstrate the discussions we've had with the landlord. So different ICBs are dealing with it differently. So it's just worth, when you get that rent review notice from the landlord, still pass it on to the ICB as normal. But if they require that you employ your own surveyor, then get in touch with a specialist primary care surveyor such as ourselves. There are other surveyors available, but just as long as you're using somebody to assist you through the process. So that's a real change, to be honest with you, an unnecessary step, I think, from the ICB. It seems to be that it's just punishing practices. It's practices that are having to fork out money and no one's really saving money. So it seems a very strange change and amendment, but that's what we're going to have to deal with and live with. So if you're in a leasehold premises and you need requirement with your lease rent review, do let us know. Now, if you're in an owner-occupied practice and you have notional rent reviews, then when you receive that notional rent assessment, what used to happen is you could just appeal that up to 3 years after the date of receiving that letter. Some ICBs, again, are interpreting the premises cost directions, which states you now have a 12-week deadline to challenge or accept the review, that it means you can only challenge it within that 12-week deadline. We personally are not interpreting that way. I believe the premises cost directions are suggesting that practices have 12 weeks to respond, or their payments will automatically change. So it's to do with the payments of the rent rather than actually physically accepting and not allowing a challenge. We've opened a number of appeals now that are outside that 12-week window with a number of different ICBs. So I think you're absolutely fine to continue to challenge the review, as long as it's within that 3-year period, which is the actual deadline, rather than this what seems like an artificial deadline, to be honest with you. So I would say if you receive your notional rent assessment and it's possible to challenge that or get a second opinion within that 12-week window, great. I would still try as hard as you can to stick to that deadline, as artificial as it may be, because it makes things easier. It makes the negotiations and the process a little bit easier if we're not having to explain the premises cost directions to the ICB. However, if you're outside that 12-week window, as long as you haven't replied accepting the proposal, then you can still potentially challenge it. So again, I'd just contact your specialist primary care surveyor with regards to that aspect. Something else that's changed is the ICB have now removed the funding gap for grants for improvements. So before, if you wanted to apply for a grant for an extension or some internal upgrades to the premises, there was a cap on that grant of 66%. So you could only receive a 66% grant. The remaining would have to be funded and put up by the practice. So the grant would be 66%. The practice would have to put up 34%. That funding gap or cap has now been removed. So the ICBs now have the power to grant you 100% for any upgrades and improvements. But to be clear, that gives the ICB the capability of providing 100%. That does not mean they're going to provide 100% every time. In fact, in my experience over the last 18 months, it's extremely rare for practice to receive 100% grant. It's not unheard of. We've got a couple of clients who are going through the process at the moment, but it is, there's still a major issue with funds and budgets within ICBs, and it makes it very difficult for them to actually provide 100% funding, 100% grants for upgrades and improvements. So it may be that you still only get 66% or a little bit less, but it's good news that it gives them the capability, and hopefully in the future they'll start providing an awful lot more at 100%. But at this moment in time, it's not made a huge amount of difference, that one. And the last point to make is with regards to leases. So if you're in a leasehold premises, you are now required to put a lease in place if all the partners have retired. So if all the partners, all the owners of the premises have retired and there's no longer any owners of the premises on the contract, then you are now required to put a lease in place and document that agreement. So with the ex-partners to the new partners, effectively. I would suggest it's probably good practice to consider doing that, even if there's just one partner that no longer practices at the surgery. If you've got one owner of the premises who is no longer on the contract, it's potentially advantageous to put a lease in place, because leases effectively avoid any disputes, and there's going to be differences in expectations when it comes to repairs and maintenance, for example. If there's an ex-partner, if the roof caves in, the ex-partner who's the owner might expect the practice to pay, but the practice might expect the ex-partner to pay. And without a lease in place, that's just going to end up in a messy dispute. So if there's any sort of unconnected party, so any sort of partner who's only a contract holder and not an owner, I'd be contemplating putting a lease in place. And it's not always required. You can potentially just make amendments to your partnership agreement to advise on what the responsibilities are of each party. But it's certainly worth getting some advice from either surveyors or solicitors to see if it would be worthwhile putting a lease in place. But it is an actual requirement to do that if all partners have left. So that is a change to the 2004 premises cost directions. Okay, so that's just a couple of key points in the premises cost directions. There's loads of different clauses and things and quite a few different changes that perhaps aren't as significant in general, but they may be more significant to you as an individual practice. We've actually put a full-on review of all the changes in the premises cost directions, and that's on our website. So if you're interested in having a read of that, pop on our website, look on our news and advice section, or email me after this and I can send you a link to it if you want to know what some of the other changes in the premises cost directions are. But moving on now to notional rent. So those of you who are in an owner-occupied practice, those of you who receive notional rent, those of you who have that checked every 3 years and potentially use a survey to challenge it, there's just a couple of things that might be useful to be made aware of. The first thing of note is that 89% of practices in the UK are underfunded when it comes to their rent reimbursement. So that is quite a scary statistic, that nearly 9 out of 10 practices aren't receiving the correct notional rent. They're getting underfunded. They're not getting the correct amount of funding. That is a statistic that we've put together. So that is purely based on our own experience. So it's based on the, we visit 400 practices a year. Of those 400 practices, 89% we managed to achieve an increase for. The other 11% were just on the right amount and they stayed the same. So that is just purely based on a relatively small pool, but this 400 practices, 89%, it's going to be there or thereabouts if you spread that out to everybody in the UK. So if you're a practice receiving notional rent and you don't normally get a second opinion, very, very important to do that. And when you go through the rent review process, as anyone who knows who's been through the rent review process when you're in an owner-occupied practice, it is so slow. And so there are a few steps you can take to try and speed the process up. The first one is just staying on top of the NHS and the ICB. So just make sure you regularly chase them, whether that's every week or every couple of weeks. Just send them a quick email to ask, firstly, where your CMR1 forms are, which kind of start the process. So just request the CMR1 forms. What happens with the ICBs is they'll send you blank forms every 3 years. So even if you've submitted completed forms 3 years prior, they don't seem to hold them on record, and they'll just send you some blank forms, which means you just have to fill those forms in from scratch, which, although they're relatively straightforward forms, they can be a little bit time consuming, answering all the questions and detailing all the rooms that are in use and things. Whereas if you can try and get hold of the previously submitted forms, either by asking the ICBs, because they should hold a record of it, to be fair, they should have some sort of record of it. They should be able to send you the previously submitted forms. If they can't, the district valuer, they should be able to get them off the district valuers. Or if you keep them on file, then it's worth just amending those, basically, rather than filling them in from scratch every 3 years. Just amend the ones that you already have and highlight any changes that you've made, if any. So I would say, moving forward, if you don't keep a record of your CMR1 forms, your completed forms, the ones that you've submitted, just try and set up a folder. So in future years, it's very easy for you to just resubmit those, and it'll save so much time, because it means as soon as your review's due, rather than waiting for the ICB and the NHS to send you fresh forms to fill in, you can just fill in the forms and ping them straight over to the ICB, and then you've done your bit. They've got the forms. It's up to them to arrange a district valuer's visit, and then you could just be chasing them every couple of weeks after that to see if they've received or instructed the district valuers for their visit and things. So the next step after that is the district valuer will come out to visit, and then the district valuer will provide the report. It is so important that you don't accept that proposal, because that's all it is. It's an initial proposal. It's the district valuer saying, we think you should be getting this X amount of money. Would you like to get a second opinion? And it's so important that you do that. From our point of view, we can check that for you free of charge, so there's not even any cost to getting a second opinion initially. There's obviously charges if you want to proceed through to a challenge, but that initial assessment is completely free of charge. So imperative, I would say, that you get a second opinion. Even if you don't use ourselves, there are other companies out there who can assist you. A lot of other companies do the free reviews as well. So it is so important to get that second opinion. Also, when you're in a leasehold premises, very important that you seek approval for any improvements. We're assisting a practice at the moment who are expecting a very large increase in their notional rent because they've built an extension. We are currently challenging that for them, but it turns out that they never requested reimbursement for that area, and the ICB are refusing to provide it. So they're losing out on tens of thousands of pounds a year in reimbursement just because they didn't seek approval. So if you're thinking of making improvements, internal improvements, or certainly if you're wanting to build an extension and making significant improvements, it is imperative that you seek approval prior to any improvements being made. It is very, very clear in the premises cost directions that retrospective approval should not be provided. So you can't just build an extension and expect to receive notional rent for it. You'll have to fill in and complete a business case and advise why you believe it's value for money for the ICB, and they are under no obligation to provide approval. It is completely at the ICB's discretion, and they can refuse it for whatever reason. So really, really important that you seek approval prior to making any changes. And if you have built an extension and you have received approval for that reimbursement, and perhaps you received a grant to build that extension, just be aware that your notional rent will likely be abated. So if you receive, let's say a 50% grant for building an extension, and that extension, you've got notional rent reimbursement for it, you've had that approval, and that extension's worth £10,000 a year. Because you've received a grant for 50%, you'll only receive 50% of that rent for a period of time, and that period could be 5, 10, 15 years, depending on the value of the grant, effectively. So the more you borrow, the higher the grant, the longer period that abatement period will be for. But what a lot of practices aren't aware is that in addition to receiving, in addition to getting the percentage that you put into the improvement grant or the improvements. So if you built an extension, you got a 50% grant and then put in 50% yourself, then technically you will receive your 50% that you put in for that space for that period of time, plus an additional 10%. So it's always plus an additional 10%. Whatever you've put in, if you put in 0%, then you'll still get the 10%, and the 10% is for the repair and maintenance, the upkeep of that extension. So you will always receive something, or you should always receive something. It's very, very important when you get your abatement calculations, again, prior to build, prior to anything, that you just check to make sure that they are offering that 10% for repair and maintenance, because it quite often gets missed in these abatement calculations. And again, that's something that ourselves and other surveyors can probably check for you, can check the abatement calculation just to make sure it is correct. Okay, so that's notional rents, that's leasehold, that's owner-occupied practices. So if you're in an owner-occupied practice, hopefully you found that useful. If you're in a leasehold premises, hopefully you went and got yourself a cup of tea. But it's your turn now. So for those who are in surgeries that are owned by landlords, just a bit of a slide to assist you with perhaps renewing your lease or putting a lease in place. So there are a few health warnings for both tenants and landlords to consider. But obviously with yourselves all being practices, just from a tenant perspective, when you're renewing your lease or when you're putting a lease in place, extremely important that you use a specific NHS GP surgery lease. Unlike commercial leases where it's just between the landlord and tenant, in a GP surgery lease, you've got a third entity. You've got the NHS effectively, and the NHS play quite significant roles in the rent reviews, the lease renewals, and so it needs to be clearly stipulated what that role is in the lease. And if you just go and get a standard commercial lease off the high street or off the internet, it's not going to be very clear, and it can cause immense amount of problems when you try and instigate a renewal, or when you try and get a rent review, or also when you try and get some grant money for improvements and upgrades, because the ICB will not approve a lease that isn't a specific NHS GP surgery lease. And if you haven't got an approved lease, then you will not be able to apply for a grant. A lot of ICBs will stop you from being able to do that. So extremely important that you use a specific GP surgery lease. Extremely important that lease is approved, as I've just said, by the ICB and the NHS, because they're going to be reimbursing your rent for the duration of the lease. So they need to see the lease and make sure it's value for money. So again, extremely important that you get that approval, and very, very important that you get that approval prior to signing the lease. Again, retrospective approval of the lease can be very, very difficult, because if the ICB don't approve it and you want to make changes, you've then got to go back to the landlord and request those changes. The landlord will be under no obligation to make those changes because you've already signed the lease. That is a contract that you have in place. So very, very important you get prior approval of the lease with that NHS GP surgery lease as well. And some of the things that the NHS will check is just to ensure you've got all the necessary protections in the lease. Make sure that you have protections for the rent, to make sure the rent can't exceed what you're getting reimbursed, so you never end up paying the landlord more than what you're receiving from the NHS. Make sure you've got protections at the end of the lease, so when it expires, you've got an automatic right to renew the lease, rather than having to worry every time the lease is up for renewal that the landlord could just kick you out. So again, just making sure you've got the necessary protections. The ICB will have a look at that for you. Probably very, very important that you get somebody independent to check that for you as well. Surveying firms like ourselves, when you're going through a lease renewal, just make sure you've got all those necessary protections and your interests or the partner's interests are all protected. You want to be checking your obligations and your repair and maintenance obligations. So who's responsible for what? If the roof leaks, whose responsibility is that? Is that yours as the practice, yours as the tenant, or it's the landlord's responsibility? So two main types really. You've got internal only, so practices are just responsible for the internal repair and maintenance, or internal and external. So the internal and the external, effectively everything. Practices are responsible for everything, which the latter is the preferred option for most landlords. Most landlords want the practice to be responsible for everything. But what a lot of practices aren't aware that is, if that is the case, then they can retain a proportion of the rent that they receive from the NHS. So if you're in a leasehold premises and you're responsible for everything, all repairs and maintenance, then it might be worthwhile checking to make sure you are retaining a sufficient amount of rent from the NHS to cover the cost of that, because that is the landlord's responsibility. The external repair and maintenance is the landlord's responsibility. So if they are batting that back to you as the tenant, there has to be some financial reward for that. So you can retain normally somewhere between 5 and 7.5% of the annual rent. So whatever the annual rent is, you can retain 5 to 7.5% of that. Put that into a sinking fund, and that should 9 times out of 10 cover the costs of any external repair and maintenance, which is the whole point of it. Is you should be retaining a sufficient amount to cover the costs of the repairs and maintenance that are needed for the duration of the lease. So again, worth potentially checking that lease, seeing what your repair and maintenance obligations are, and making sure you are retaining the necessary rent. And then the final point to consider is a lease regear prior to expiry of the lease. So if you are in a leasehold premises and you've got maybe 5, 6, 7 years left to run on a long-term lease, so you originally signed a 25, maybe 30-year lease, you've got 5 years or 6 years left to run on it. That is an optimum time to negotiate a renewal or a re-gear with the landlord, because from the landlord's perspective, the value of that premises is diminishing every year that that lease expires. So as it draws closer to the end of the lease, the value of the premises is significantly lower than it was when the lease was signed, when it was a 30-year lease. So a lot of landlords would be very, very keen on renewing a lease to provide them extra security, signing another long-term lease, 25, 30 years. But they may also be willing to either pay you a premium for that. So we've had practices that have been paid, hundreds of thousands of pounds for renewing their lease early. We've had practices that have had extensions built, who've had upgrades and improvements done. So it's a really good time to negotiate things. If you're in a practice that needs upgrades and improvements and you're a few years around to the end of the lease, it might be worth contacting your landlord to say, look, I'd be willing to sign another long-term lease, but we're running out of space, we need upgrades, we need improvements. Can you look at considering doing these improvements, and we'll sign another 25, 30-year lease. So again, very, very good time, around 5, 6, 7 years before. As it draws closer and closer to the end of the lease, the landlords are less and less likely to do it because there's just not enough time to make the improvements, and you've not got enough time to find alternative premises. If you decided to try and negotiate some upgrades and improvements 6 months before the expiry of the lease, the landlord could just say no, and there's nothing you can do about it. You're not going to be able to find another premises to move out of in six months' time, because everybody knows that process can take years and years. So it's about finding that optimum time to do that. And like I said, 5, 6 years would give you plenty of time to find alternative premises. It means you hold the cards in those negotiations. So that's worth considering as well. Okay, so, and you can also instigate a renewal 12 months prior to the expiry of the lease. So just a little point to be aware of. When the lease expires, if you're going to wait until the end of the lease, you don't want to make any upgrades and improvements, you didn't want to sign the lease earlier, then it might be worthwhile looking at renewing that lease 12 months prior to expiry, because the process can take quite a long time. If you leave that for a few weeks beforehand, you're going to be occupying a premises with an expired lease for a number of months while the lease renewal goes on. So if you can, it's always advisable to try and renew the lease 12 months prior to expiry to give you the best opportunity to have it all agreed when the lease finally expires. Okay, I believe there's a couple more slides, so it should only be another 5, 6 minutes or so, but I'll try and whiz through it as quickly as possible. These are probably the last slide, and certainly this slide I know we missed when we went through it on Thursday, so this will be interesting for everybody. So I'm going to talk through how to maximize the value of the premises effectively. So those practices who own the premises, how can you maximize the value of the premises? The best way to maximize the value of the premises is to maximize your rental income. You maximize your rental income, that's going to have an automatic knock-on effect to the value of the premises. So even increasing the rental income by as little as £1,000 a year that could potentially increase the value of the premises by £10,000–15,000. It can have a huge knock-on effect potentially to the value. The best way to increase your rental income, as I've mentioned in a couple of slides ago, is to get your notional rent checked by an independent surveyor, just to make sure you're maximising that rental income that you're receiving from the NHS. You can also ensure that any lease agreements you have, their rental amounts are up to date. So if you rent out space to a pharmacy or a chiropractor or a dentist, whatever it may be, just making sure that A, they're in an existing lease, B, that lease is for as long as possible. So the longer that lease term, the higher the capital value of that premises is going to be. So the longer the lease, the better. And also just making sure if they're in a lease, that any outstanding rent reviews are instigated and you're maximising that rental income as well from the other occupants in the premises. Also very, very important that you make the most of any spare space or non-reimbursable areas. So if there's areas of the premises that you're not currently getting reimbursed for, or areas that you're not currently using for reimbursement, it might be worth considering either A, seeing if you can apply for reimbursement, put a clinical room in there, admin space, storage space, whatever it may be, and seeing if you can actually seek approval from the ICB to receive notional rent for that space, or see if it's possible to get an alternative therapist in, perhaps, to rent that space out from you to increase the rental income for the premises. And then the last couple of points, upgrades and improvements to your surgery and extensions as well. So if you're modernising the surgery, that's going to increase the rental income, and certainly extensions are, as long as you get that approval that I talked about earlier. If you're increasing the space on the premises and you receive a reimbursement from the ICB, then that's going to have a knock-on effect to the value of the premises. So all upgrades and improvements and extensions are worth considering when we're looking at maximising the value of the premises. Okay, last bit is our free premises health check. So we've gone through the presentation, just something that we can help everyone who's on the who attended the webinar last Thursday, and everyone who's listened to this pre-recorded webinar today. We can offer free consultations to all GP practice staff, practice managers, business managers, finance managers, GP partners, whoever it may be. If you've got a question about your premises, then just pick up the phone and give us a call. If we're not available right away, then we will give you a call. We can arrange a Teams, or we can arrange a call at a convenient time to talk through your issues and the problems that you're having, and see if we can come up with a solution or a way in which we can help you moving forward. And some of the free things that we can assist on the back of that free consultation, the telephone call, is we can assess your notional rent reimbursement free of charge, check to make sure that's in line with the current market, make sure you're not getting underfunded. We can check your GP surgery lease free of charge to have a look at that, maybe check to see if what your retention eligibility is, see what your repair and maintenance obligations are, see when your lease expires and your rent reviews, make sure you have all the necessary protections in the lease. So we can review all leases free of charge as well. And then including pharmacy leases as well. We can actually do the same on a pharmacy lease, but from your perspective as the landlord rather than the tenant. And we can check pharmacy rents as well. Very easy to do a desktop valuation on pharmacy rents. We can give you an idea of whether what you're receiving is correct and in line with the current markets and things. And there's a few other things we can do as well from a free premises health check. Again, you can go on our website, bwhealthcaresurveyors.co.uk. And the last thing I want to say is, whatever you decide to do next, it's imperative that you receive the correct advice from specialist surveyors, from ourselves or other specialist surveyors. But it's not just surveyors. There's so much free advice out there from accountants and solicitors. So just make sure you're maximising that free advice, really. The LMCs can obviously help with advice, ICBs. There's so much advice out there. There's so much literature out there. There's so much content out there. If any of those, for those of you who are familiar with ChatGPT, just ping a question over to ChatGPT. It's actually that easy now, and you should get a lot of the answers that you require, or at least the best places to search for any additional information and things. And we're always on the end of the phone. Call us anytime, and Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, office hours. Give us a call, and we can have a conversation with you about any specific issues you're having. That's our address if you want to send us a letter. If you're old school, not sure when the last time we received a letter was, but it'd be very exciting if anybody wanted to send us a letter and ask us a question. That would be a very big deal. But otherwise, if you're more modern than that, then feel free to give us a call. That's my direct line there, the one ending in 0098. That's obviously my email address as well. Or you can go on the website, and we've got a contact us page on the website as well. Plenty of information on there. So feel free to get in touch if you've got any questions or queries. And again, my sincere apologies if I wasted anybody's time last Wednesday with the webinar. It was obviously unforeseen circumstances with the connectivity issues we're having. But hopefully you've enjoyed this. Hopefully it's been worth your while. It was worth the wait. You found it useful. And if you do have any questions or queries, just pick up the phone or send me an email. I'm more than happy to help. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you again to Essex LMC for helping me put this together and putting it on. I will see you hopefully very, very soon, and have a great afternoon.